The podcast begins by discussing Joe Biden's poor performance in the recent debate against Donald Trump. Shapiro argues that Biden's campaign has no good days left, and the only positive outcome for him would be something negative happening to Trump. He emphasizes that the cover-up of Biden's mental and physical decline is worse than the actual decline itself. Shapiro claims that everyone, including the Biden family, White House staff, and media, has been lying about Biden's capabilities for years. The debate performance is described as a watershed moment where Biden's decline was undeniably evident to the public. Shapiro argues that this has destroyed the credibility of Biden's supporters and campaign team, making it impossible for them to convincingly argue that he is fit for the presidency. He points out that Biden would be 86 years old by the end of a potential second term, raising serious concerns about his ability to serve. The podcast discusses the media's reaction to Biden's debate performance, noting that many outlets and pundits who previously defended Biden are now expressing concern or calling for him to drop out of the race. Shapiro argues that the media has lost credibility on this issue, having promoted what he considers an obvious lie about Biden's capabilities. The Biden campaign's response to the debate fallout is then examined. Shapiro reads from an email sent by the campaign to supporters, which attempts to downplay the significance of Biden's performance and argues that he remains the best candidate to defeat Trump. The email claims that Biden's post-debate activities, including traveling and giving speeches, demonstrate his energy and capability. The podcast covers the reactions of various Democratic Party figures to Biden's debate performance. It notes that while some, like the New York Times editorial board, have called for Biden to step aside, many party leaders are publicly supporting him. Shapiro argues that this support is driven by political necessity rather than genuine belief in Biden's fitness for office. The podcast also discusses the dilemma faced by the Democratic Party, as there is no clear mechanism to replace Biden as the nominee without his voluntary withdrawal. Shapiro suggests that the party is stuck with Biden due to the financial and logistical challenges of changing candidates at this stage of the campaign. Shapiro delves into the role of the Biden family in the decision to keep Joe Biden in the race. He argues that the family, particularly Biden's wife Jill, is pushing for him to continue his campaign despite his apparent decline. The podcast suggests that this is driven by a desire to maintain power and financial benefits associated with the presidency. Shapiro criticizes the Biden family, accusing them of corruption and using Joe Biden's political career for personal gain. He argues that their insistence on keeping Biden in the race is motivated by self-interest rather than concern for the country's well-being. The podcast discusses the potential implications of Biden's debate performance and continued candidacy for the 2024 election. Shapiro argues that Trump now has a significant advantage and suggests that the best strategy for Trump would be to adopt a low-profile approach similar to Biden's 2020 campaign. Shapiro presents polling data showing a decline in support for Biden and an increase in concerns about his age and mental fitness. He argues that these numbers indicate a serious problem for the Democratic Party and Biden's re-election prospects. The podcast then shifts to discuss recent Supreme Court rulings. It covers the overturning of the Chevron deference doctrine, which had given administrative agencies significant power in interpreting ambiguous statutes. Shapiro explains the implications of this ruling, arguing that it will force Congress to be more specific in legislation and reduce the power of unelected bureaucrats. Another ruling discussed is the Supreme Court's decision to raise the bar for obstruction charges against January 6 defendants and potentially Donald Trump. Shapiro argues that this is a positive development as it narrows the scope of what can be considered obstruction of an official proceeding. The podcast concludes with a discussion of recent developments in French politics. It notes the strong performance of Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party in parliamentary elections, describing it as a shift towards the right in French politics. Shapiro argues that this reflects growing concerns about immigration and dissatisfaction with traditional centrist policies in France. The podcast features an interview with Bernie Moreno, the Republican senatorial candidate for Ohio in the 2024 election. Moreno is challenging incumbent Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. Moreno begins by challenging the perception that Brown is a moderate, bipartisan senator. He argues that Brown is one of the most radical senators in office and has been in politics for too long. Moreno criticizes Brown's record on manufacturing jobs, claiming that Ohio has lost 200,000 such jobs under Brown's watch due to high taxes, regulations, and attacks on the energy sector. Regarding polling, Moreno acknowledges that he is currently behind Brown, but expresses confidence that he can close the gap once voters become more familiar with his positions. He emphasizes his stance on energy dominance, border security, support for Israel, and peace and stability around the world. Moreno discusses his background in the automotive business and criticizes government mandates and incentives in the electric vehicle market. He argues for letting consumers drive innovation rather than bureaucrats. On energy policy, Moreno advocates for making the United States energy dominant, including the use of coal, natural gas, oil, and nuclear power. He also calls for reducing regulations on businesses. In foreign policy, Moreno strongly criticizes Brown's stance on Israel, accusing him of weakening support for Israel for political reasons. Moreno pledges unequivocal support for Israel and argues that Brown sides with terrorist supporters. Shapiro concludes by emphasizing the importance of this Senate race, noting that if Moreno doesn't defeat Brown, it could lead to a continuation of Chuck Schumer as Senate Majority Leader. The podcast covers a wide range of topics, primarily focusing on the fallout from Joe Biden's debate performance and its implications for the 2024 election. It also touches on important Supreme Court rulings and developments in French politics. The overall tone is critical of Biden and the Democratic Party, while supportive of conservative positions and candidates like Bernie Moreno. Shapiro presents a narrative of a Democratic Party in crisis, struggling to manage an aging and potentially incapable candidate while facing growing challenges from the right both domestically and internationally.